Welcome to the first lecture in our online statistics class. By this point, you should have explored the classroom a little bit, read the syllabus, reviewed this week's to-do list, and taken a look at the introductory video. Now we're ready to get going with our first discussion on Chapter 1, or the Foundations of Inferential Statistics. Each week in our lecture materials, you will see a slide like this, a slide with learning outcomes listed on it, which will tell you the most important things that you should be getting out of our lecture time this week. Principally, what we're going to do in Chapter 1 is talk about statistical terminology, statistical measurement, some of the key research issues, and the purpose of statistics. Something I want you to keep in mind is that unlike most other math classes you might have taken, statistics is entirely applied. That is, everything we do answers a specific research question or solves a specific type of problem. So if you're in here, it's highly likely that as a professional, you'll need to deal with these sorts of issues in your real world work life. So one of our goals in this class that's not listed on the learning outcomes is to make sure that you are well equipped to do so. Take a look at Math Skills Assessment and the Math Skills Review in Appendix A. This is time well spent for you, whether it's just a review and you're fully proficient in all of the math skills that we're going to need to use, or if you may need to remediate some of your math skills a little bit, that's time well spent too. The reason for this is I will never ask you about your performance in the Appendix A questions. It's just for you to know where you are, but you're going to need to know how to do these sort of fundamental math skills to be successful in the class. So now's the time to find out, and if you have a little catching up to do, that's good to know at this part as we're just getting started. All of psychology, and really all of science, is about gathering information to answer specific types of questions. Statistics is the way that we make sense of all of that information to find out the truth as best we can. Basically, statistics is a strategy to help us make sense of all of the numbers. It helps us draw accurate conclusions to know, for example, if a costly medical procedure helped enough people to be worthwhile, or if, for example, a time-consuming and challenging educational program benefited the children more than the standard way of doing things. In a real sense, statistics help scientists bring order to the chaos. How do they do that? Well, one way is by being standardized. The work of one researcher will be familiar and interpretable by another one, maybe even in another part of the world, so that they can understand the basis for each other's conclusions. It's a common scientific language, if you will. So, in a real sense, what statistics is doing is allowing us to communicate basic scientific findings to other people who are working in the area. Statistics helps us describe our observations and clearly communicate important details like how sure are we and why are we that sure. Now, as promised, some important terminology to get us started. First, we need to talk about the population. The population is defined as the set of all of the individuals of interest in a particular study. So, if we were interested in the sleeping habits of women, for example, we would be interested in all women on Earth. Now, it's completely infeasible to study all women on Earth for reasons that I hope are pretty obvious. There's too many of them, we could never get them all in the lab, etc., etc. So, though populations vary in size, they're often quite large and therefore completely impossible to study in their entirety. For that reason, research is typically done with a subset of the population of interest, and that subset is known as the sample. The sample is supposed to represent the population, which we cannot measure in its entirety. So, for example, if we were interested in the sleeping habits of women, we may choose 200 women in Northwest Arkansas to represent that population. So here's a graphic depicting what we've just talked about on the last slide, We begin with a population, in this case, all the women on Earth, which we obviously can't study, so we select a sample or a subset from that population, which in this case is 200 women from Northwest Arkansas. Those women participate in our study on the sleeping habits of women, and we draw some conclusions about how much they're sleeping or how effective their sleeping is, or whatever we were interested in for our research question, and we draw conclusions about that sample, which we generalize to the population as a whole. That is, we say whatever we've learned about these 200 women in Northwest Arkansas is in some way representative of women in general. Some more important terminology here, variables and data on this slide. A variable is a characteristic or a condition that changes. It's what we're measuring in this study. It's one of the things that we're interested in. So we were interested in sleeping habits of women in the last study. That would be a variable for us. Data is a plural word. Nobody ever knows that, but it's in fact a plural of the word datum, also on the slide. A datum is a singular observation. It's one person's score on one person's variable. So it's often called a score or a raw score. If you have multiple observations or multiple data points, those are then constituting the data set or a collection of measurements or observations. Next, we've got to talk about parameters and statistics, which are essentially the same thing at a different level of measurement. Either one is a value, typically a number, a numerical value that describes the group that you're studying. So a population is described by a parameter. A sample, on the other hand, is described by a statistic. So the number of hours per night that all of the women on Earth are sleeping on average would be a parameter value, whereas the number of hours that our 200 women in Northwest Arkansas are sleeping on average would be a statistic value because it applies to the sample and not to the population. Next, we'll talk about descriptive and inferential statistics, both of which are something that we will do in this class together. First, descriptive statistics are typically a starting point. They simply summarize, organize, or simplify data. They don't add anything to the data. They don't particularly give you any conclusions about the data. They just make the data more manageable and easier to look at. So you've all seen examples of descriptive statistics lots of times. There are things like tables, graphs, averages. They describe, if you will. They provide summary information. So rather than looking at an Excel spreadsheet with 200 rows and 300 columns of individual data points, you instead look at a table and you can pretty easily see, oh, this is what's going on with the basic trends in this study. On the other hand, the second step is typically inferential statistics. So first, researchers will use descriptives to describe, but then they'll move on and use inferential statistics to infer. That is, to make generalizations about a population based on sample data. That is, to interpret what the results mean. You've seen some terminology related to this, no doubt. Words like statistically significant or margin of error. If you see those types of words, then you know that some manner of inferential statistics has been done. Sampling error is a really important concept that sometimes confuses people. I think the reason it confuses people is because when we hear the word error, we think a mistake has been made or somebody did something wrong. However, that's not at all the case with sampling error in statistics. Sampling error refers to the fact that no sample is ever identical to the population. Think for a minute about how many different samples of 200 women we could draw from the entire population of women on Earth. No one of those samples would ever be identical to the whole population. It's this discrepancy, or the amount of error, that is known as the sampling error. For this reason, Statistics are never exactly equal to the parameters that they're meant to estimate. This is a never-ending issue in inferential statistics because we always have to measure and account for the amount of sampling error to make sure that it's not unduly affecting the results of our studies. Here's a graphic depicting the issue of sampling error. In the circle, a population of 1,000 college students is represented. The average age, average IQ, and proportion of males and females are represented as population parameters. Then, in the boxes below, you'll see that two different samples have been drawn, sample 1 and sample 2, each with 5 different people drawn from the overall population of college students. Each sample also has sample statistics, average age, average IQ, and proportion of male to female. If you look at the statistics for sample 1, for example, you might imagine that the average age and average IQ of college students is somewhat lower than the population parameters from which they were drawn. Also, if you look at sample 2, you would have a very different conclusion about the proportion of college students that are female than if you looked at the actual population parameters. So in each case, neither sample is a perfect representation of the population from which it was drawn. So let's put all of this together in an example. In step 1, we conduct an experiment. We start with a population of college students and draw 2 different samples, sample A and sample B, which we will use to compare the efficacy of 2 different study methods. Participants in sample A will be instructed to read instructions from printed papers, and participants in sample B will be instructed to read instructions from a computer screen. Data are collected, that is, test scores from all of the individuals in sample A and all of the individuals in sample B, which you can see presented here in columns. In step 2, descriptive statistics have been done, so little graphs have been used to plot all of the scores from all of the participants in the 2 samples, and an average was calculated. The average test score for sample A is 26, and the average test score for sample B is 22. Nothing has been done here except describing the numbers as they existed. In step 3, another step is taken, that is, the inferential statistics step, where we begin to interpret the results. There's a 4-point difference between the test scores in sample A and sample B, but there's 2 potential ways of interpreting this. It's possible that there's really no difference between studying from printed papers or studying from computer screens. Instead, that the 4-point difference is simply accounted for because the sample A students happen to be smarter or better prepared or whatever. However, there's also a second explanation that could be true. It could be the case that the printed papers condition was a better way to study, and that's why their test scores were higher. The goal of inferential statistics is to help researchers decide which of these 2 interpretations is supported by the available evidence. Just to make sure everybody's on track, let's do a learning check question. A researcher is interested in the effect of the amount of sleep on high school students' exam scores. A group of 75 high school boys agree to participate in the study. The boys are, what do you think it is? Of course, D is the correct answer. In this instance, the 75 high school boys who agreed to participate in this study represent a sample. Remember, if you have any questions about this or anything else we talk about, just post them in this week's discussion forum, and that way we can have a continued discussion so that you really understand everything that we're talking about. Here's another one, this time a true or false question. Most research studies use data from samples. True or false? What do you think? The answer is true. Most of the time, researchers have to use samples because it's impossible to measure the entirety of a population and do research that way. Let's do one more in this section. True or false? When a sample differs from the population, there must be a systematic difference between the groups. The answer this time is false. It's also possible that random error or sampling error could produce unsystematic group differences that had nothing to do with the treatment condition itself.